Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Challenge for Sustainable Aviation Fuels Beyond COVID-19. We are grateful to our moderator, Dr. Steve Griffiths, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We're also grateful to the Abu Dhabi Association for Energy Economics, who is partnering with IAEE for today's webinar. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Steve Griffiths, Senior Vice President for Research and Development and Professor of Practice at Khalifa University. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to everyone who's attending today's webinar focused on the challenge for sustainable aviation fuels beyond COVID-19. As Dave said, I'm Steve Griffiths, Senior Vice President, Research and Development and Professor of Practice at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi, and I'm moderating today's session. Joining me today on the panel are 3 very distinguished aviation sector experts. First, Robert Boyd, Senior Manager, Aviation Environment at the International Air Transport Association, IATA, in Switzerland. Secondly, Jim Hileman, Chief Scientific and Technical Advisor for Environment at the Federal Aviation Administration of the United States. And finally, Alejandro Rios-Galvan, Director of the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium at the Khalifa University of Science and Technology here in the United Arab Emirates. Before moving into the opening remarks and presentations from the panelists, I'll provide a little bit of context for the topic of today's webinar. According to IEA data, the global transportation sector emitted approximately 8 gigatons of carbon dioxide in 2018, and this level of emissions follows from a consistent upward trend in recent years. We know that road transportation is by far the biggest contributor of transportation carbon emissions, contributing approximately 74% of the total. But in recent years, decarbonization attention is turning increasingly toward modes of transportation that we're considering to be particularly challenging in the realm of decarbonization, aviation being one of these sectors. Unlike cars, large aircraft are not easily powered by batteries. They're coupled to clean power. And so the sector requires other means of reducing carbon emissions. And this is going to be one of the key focus of today's discussion. Although the sector itself, the aviation sector, emits just under a gigaton of CO2, which is only about 11% of annual transportation sector emissions, under a business as usual environment, those emissions would be expected to grow rather strongly, increasing business travel, international tourism, and the establishment, of course, of new airlines to support these activities would, if things were normal, make this growth in emissions continue into the future. In an effort to avoid such a mitigation or avoid such growth in emissions and to mitigate this growth, the International Civil Aviation Administration organization, ICAO, set a number of aspirational goals to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in the coming years through the establishment of key technologies and operational paradigms, including sustainable aviation fuels, which is the focus of today's discussion. Of course, everything I've just said in the context I was talking about was prior to the COVID-19 health pandemic of 2020, which has really decimated the aviation sector. Although we're seeing some aviation recovery, demand recovery happening now, the outlook for air travel and aviation fuels remains unclear. And so this is going to be one of the very key points of our discussion today. With this background in the webinar, we'll move on to the discussion of the panelists who will be addressing this very specific and interesting topic of the challenge for sustainable aviation fuels beyond COVID-19. Before moving into the opening presentations, I'd like to remind all of you that have joined us today that you can submit your questions during the course of the presentations, because after the presentations finish, we'll be addressing those as they've come to us, and then we'll have a nice discussion to see how we can address your questions in the most relevant manner. Let me first now turn to Robert and ask him to kick off our panel discussion with his perspective on the state of the airline industry due to COVID-19 and the outlook for sustainable aviation fuels moving forward from the airline's perspective. Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm just going to bring up this presentation now. Hopefully everyone can see that. Just a quick confirmation that you can see the presentation. Great. Well, look, yeah, thank you again. And look, thanks to the organisers and the host of the event for the opportunity to be here. I mean, Steve, you just, in your remarks, said the aviation industry was has been decimated. It's a strong word, but actually fairly accurate, I think. If I go to the next slide here, if this is actually going to work. There we go. Yes, and look, just to bring this point home, I think many of you would remember the global financial crisis, some 10 years ago. That was, I think at the time, probably regarded as one of the most severe economic events that many of us had lived through in our lifetime. If you cast your eyes on the chart here to 2009, remembering just how severe that was, and particularly if you look at the blue line, which is revenue passenger kilometres, it's only a minor depression there in the trajectory of the chart. There's perhaps a few reasons there too. Oil price was, of course, very high around that time. It fell, notably in 2009. That helped stimulate some demand and accelerate the recovery. But I mean, if you cast your eyes towards the current time, 2020, well, the chart speaks for itself. It's incredibly severe. And even we all know how severe this is, but sometimes just looking at this chart becomes a little bit mesmerising just how severe this is on the aviation industry. So I guess the question we're interested in part here is, well, what does the recovery or the potential path of the recovery profile look like? I mean, we will see a recovery, of course, with all the stimulus that's being provided and the different measures. But one, I think, point to bear in mind is this is a fairly protracted recovery here relative to the previous situations. Now, this is an IATA forecast. There may be other forecasts out there, of course. But what you'll note is that, well, obviously severe downturn in 2020, but even in 2021, we're still forecasting to be 35% below the 2019 level of RPKs. And in fact, not exceeding the 2019 level of revenue passenger kilometres until 2024. So, this is a fairly sombre backdrop that the industry is operating in at the moment. There's some reasons, and perhaps in the questions, I'm happy to talk about why we have a fairly, sort of a relatively bearish outlook in terms of the recovery profile. But there's a lot of different government measures at the moment in terms of ease of travel. But we can talk a little bit about these. So the question is, or one question, of course, then is, well, what does this do to the profitability of the industry? And particularly when we're thinking about, I guess, environmental initiatives. The industry has had a reasonably good decade, actually, relative to history, where the industry has been profitable for consecutive years. The sombre reality of the current situation is the forecast losses, not just this year, but then, of course, in next year as well, we forecast an industry loss. In nominal terms, it actually wipes out the half of the net profit that the industry's made since the Second World War. So I think that puts the perspective there of just how severe this is. Now, of course, it has been support and stimulus for the industry, very importantly. However, this is a major financial shock when it comes to profitability. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a somber opening. I'm sorry for that, but I was told to paint the picture and I have to do that accurately. That's how it is. What I'd, now perhaps draw our attention to a little bit is some actual things that have happened within the IATA world. IATA is the industry association, represents about 290 of commercial airlines. Our governance body is our airline CEOs, 25 of them. there's been a number of emergency sort of board meetings that have been held. One was in May, and the priority from that was to develop a declaration on aviation and what it would look like coming out of this and the restart. Now you can see 5 key points that were presented. It's public, it's had in the press release. But what I draw your attention to there is the yellow. I mean, really, there didn't need to be that 4th one in there, but that was an active choice from the CEOs who, just because there is severe short-term, real short-term crisis, short to medium-term crisis, it doesn't discard what are longer-term, focus and consideration. And the environment is really a key pillar of aviation into the future. There's no doubt about that. And it was affirmed by this declaration. So what are these commitments? Well, we've had first commitment, which was an efficiency improvement. I'm not going to talk about that. We probably know that one. It's more or less finished. The second is carbon neutral growth 2020. Now that remains in place. Many of you have seen that. The longer term goal is to halve the net CO2 emissions by the year 2050 relative to 2005. And I've put some numbers up there to sort of quantify what that really means. Now, the 2 billion tonnes, which is a forecast, a 2050 forecast, that could be higher, it could be lower. You can pick your own number. We do know where we're heading towards. That's 325 million. That's half of what we were in 2005. But the reality is sustainable aviation fuel needs to play a substantial role in the achievement of this long-term goal. So that's very important. Okay, an interesting question when you look at CORSIA there, the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme, which is to start in 2021, is we know carbon credits are part of that, part of the method to comply, but so is sustainable aviation fuel. And perhaps the question you think is, well, does that really incentivize the use of sustainable aviation fuel? And if I took a poll of the audience, I think I'd get a mixed response. I think some of you would say, yes, maybe it does. And I think some would probably say, well, no, offset prices are fairly cheap. It probably doesn't. And I think in a sense, both answers have validity. What I would say from the airline's perspective is the inclusion of sustainable aviation fuel has dramatically increased the understanding of SAF among the airlines. And not just the understanding, but the prioritisation. So that to me is probably the greatest thing that CORSIA has done so far in terms of building and accelerating airline understanding of this. I'll move through quickly. Fact check, I think some of you probably know this. You can look at the slides. I'm not going to dwell on it to stick to time, but three things. There's been a lot of flights now. We know how to do it. There's no technical barriers, 7 technically approved pathways and more in progress, more coming down the road. We're getting better at the life cycle accounting in terms of CO2 reduction achievement. And to date, there are a number of offtake agreements. There needs to be certainly more going forward, but the industry has already made some substantial commitments here. So it's understanding how to introduce SAF as business as usual. This is positive. So the question I think we're talking about here today, what's SAF beyond COVID? I've put a few thoughts up there, which in a way I think are good conversation starters, perhaps for the question time. I'm going to just share a couple of thoughts quickly to stay on time. These are all headlines I grabbed in honesty over the past 2 or 3 days. Every single day there are headlines coming out about what aviation should be doing, needs to be doing, is doing. And perhaps one of the interesting things I noticed compared to 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, where it was more specific sets in the media that were reporting on this. This is broad media now, The Economist, Forbes, the major broadsheets that cover this. But this is not going away, absolutely not, and it's political as well. So I tried, just to finish off, I tried to, whilst we could talk about all of these things for in great depth, but I've tried to distill it down in my mind as to what are the three, the three things that are going to drive SAF post-COVID, and the small rectangular boxes under the bigger boxes, I think, are the important ones to think about. So consumers are important, but they're not everything. They're not going to make or break this, but they do make individual choices. We already know that, whether it be offsetting, whether it be the opportunity to even purchase SAF for their flight. But that's relatively small at the moment. They are having increasing political influence. These topics, environmental topics politically, in many parts of the world, becoming more and more elevated and sensitive. In corporations, I think the same theme is happening there. We are seeing direct action from corporates, even the most recent one, Amazon, engaging in an offtake agreement to purchase SAF. Microsoft have done the same. These are quite substantial ones too, but I think this is just the start from corporates. I think they're partly doing this for, just to set their own standard high, but they're also meeting the expectation of their shareholders. And then I think governments probably play the most critical role in the early stage, which the post-COVID world, there's no doubt, there's substantial fiscal spending, which is there to stimulate economies. This is a great opportunity for accelerating SAF, and I believe it will. There's also SAF-specific policy, which is becoming, well, it's here now, but it's going to become even more important, and it's going to actually be developed without a doubt over the next 2 to 5 years, I think, in many parts of the world. And I wouldn't underestimate the relevance of the work that ICAO's doing. Should be IC. I messed up the words there on ICAO, but and Jim no doubt can talk about that. But the power of ICAO to bring together global agreements is really important here. And that's happening. All of this is happening, I think, with an undercurrent of what I call influencing stakeholders. And this could be coalitions like what Alejandro is referring to as setting up here with the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Initiative, UAE. Many of these think tanks, public commitments, government sort of coalitions, things like CAFI as well. And this momentum is getting stronger and stronger, and it's going to, I call it, provide a tailwind for SAF acceleration beyond COVID. So a bit of a somber backdrop, I guess, in my opening remarks, but I actually think COVID may well be a tailwind ultimately for the acceleration of SAF deployment. So I'll pass it back to you, Steve, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Very interesting opening remarks. Certainly some concerns, but a little bit of hope and optimism put in there as well, so that's good to hear. Let's now turn over to Jim for your perspective on this topic, and then finally we'll go to Alejandro. So Jim, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to share my screen as well. Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the organizers as well. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk about where things stand. And Robert, that was an excellent background to lay out what I'll be talking about here. So what I'm going to do is cover two specific topics. I'm going to talk about what we're seeing with U.S. airlines and sustainable aviation production here in the United States. And then I have a couple of slides talking about what's happening with respect to sustainable aviation fuels within ICAO and CORSIA. So as Robert's laid out and did a very good job, COVID-19 has had a severe impact on the industry. I'll be honest, Robert, that chart you showed with the drop-off is, that is something. Never thought that would happen. But what I've been also very impressed with from U.S. industry, from the airlines, is their commitment to SAF in the long term. So we're seeing that. We're seeing continued activity, as I'll be talking about. Business aviation is actually increasing their activity level. We have support for some domestic policy changes that we're seeing. The announcements from airlines continue to come forward. And the airlines, as we're watching them, continue to be out there working to make SAF a reality. So in terms of the announcements, this is from a single U.S. producer. World Energy Paramount is a facility in Southern California in the LA area that is a repurposed asphalt refinery. It came into production in 2016, and then since then it's been increasing production and been providing diesel fuel into the California market and sustainable aviation fuel to the LAX, Los Angeles International. And the initial buyers were United, and Gulfstream, United for their fleet out in LA, and Gulfstream actually to power the aircraft that are leaving their facility in Savannah. But we've also had Amazon Prime Air is now purchasing fuel. We have a number of others who are also in the process of lining up fuel purchases, and there's been deliveries of fuel to SFO San Francisco International. So this is all happening in spite of what's happening with COVID. And so the other thing I've been particularly worried about is we have a number of SAF facilities that are coming online in the coming years, and I've been very concerned, you know, that with the financial ramifications of COVID, they would be shutting down. But thus far, I haven't seen any delays. I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. World Energy, the facility I told you about in Southern California, they're looking to expand from their current 40 million gallon per year capacity to over 300 million gallons per year in 2 years. Fulcrum Bioenergy is continuing their plans with their Reno, Nevada facility, as well as their Gary, Indiana facility. These would use municipal solid waste to create SAF. Red Rock Biofuels is also continuing on. They would use forest waste. Gevo has been working for a while and is continuing on pace to stand up production in the next 2 years to make jet fuel, to make SAF via corn to isobutanol. LanzaJet just made their announcement this year that they're going to take an existing facility that had been meant for ethanol production to be making a sustainable aviation fuel there, using ethanol as an intermediary. And then there's Sunshine Biofuels down on the Mississippi River that's going to use the ARA technology with different types of fats, oils, greases, renewable vegetable oils to have production. So all of these facilities are in the process of being stood up. They'll all have a production slate of diesel and jet fuel. But most importantly, the timelines are not shifting to the right, and they're going forward. And so this leads me to a chart that we've been tracking for many years in the U.S. within the Federal Aviation Administration. What we've been doing is tracking fuel production and consumption within the United States. This is actually gallons uplifted in the United States. It's neat gallons per year. So this is the actual renewable fuels, the SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuels. The blue bars are government procurements. The red bars are commercial procurements. As somebody who works with the public funds, taxpayer funds, it makes me very happy to see that the investments that we made from 2007 to 15 in procuring these fuels to show that they are safe for use has paid off so quickly from just one facility. And year on year, we're seeing the production ramp up. I realize these numbers are relatively small now, but it's growing quickly. And as I showed on the previous chart, it is expanding. And I would note that just in 1 month, in April of this year, there was 1.2 million gallons of SAF procured within the United States, which matched, you know, that 2016 number. So in 1 month, we were able to match the production of a whole year, and we're well past having the fuel procurement far exceeding what we have produced, what we procured from the government side. All right, so I'll shift gears here and now talk a little bit about Sustainable Aviation Fuels and CORSIA. So CORSIA is the global carbon offsetting scheme that's been set up by the International Civil Aviation Organization. And this is meant to use offsetting to help international aviation meet that carbon neutral growth goal that Robert alluded to. It's not a tax, it's not an emissions trading scheme, it's an offsetting scheme, applying to international operations from 2021 to 2035. We're working toward the initial pilot phase. And airlines are reporting to their states on their actual emissions and fuel use. We in the United States just got our reports. I'm very happy at the tremendous response that we've gotten from our industry and support from the industry. So in addition to offsetting to meet the goal of carbon neutral growth, CORSIA eligible fuels can also be used. I actually did a CAFE webinar that took an hour where I just went into all the gory details on this. So what I would recommend to you all is go straight to the source. ICAO is doing a very good job of documenting what's going on with CORSIA eligible fuels and how they can get credited. This covers both sustainable aviation fuels as well as lower carbon aviation fuels. And there's a lot of information out on the ICAO website. All the key documents are here. So there are ongoing efforts within ICAO's Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection relating to SAF. There's two primary fronts that are dealing with sustainable aviation fuels. One is the Fuels Task Group. This is the group that I co-lead with Cesar Velarde of Spain and have tremendous support from my co-participants, co-panelists here, as well as a wealth of other people. And so our current efforts are determining how to calculate life cycle emissions values for lower carbon aviation fuels, expanding out the LCA values that are available for use with different sustainable aviation fuels, and then thinking through how to strengthen the sustainability criteria. We're also continuing our work to think through potential policies that could support the deployment of SAF and putting out guidance on those capturing lessons learned. Also as well, the CAPE has undertaken a new task to, at the direction of the Assembly and Council, to explore the feasibility of a long-term global aspirational goal for international civil aviation CO2 emissions. And this group, a task group's been formed that's looking at fuels, technology, and operations, with all of the work going to inform the 41st ICAO Assembly in October 2022. And if you want to know more about, these task groups, what they're doing, what's going on, I've provided some web links to the relevant ICAO pages at the bottom. So I'm happy to field questions at the end, but until then, Steve, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Jim. That was a very, very good summarization of much that's happening in the industry right now. So it's very helpful. It sets up rather well our final speaker and presenter, Alejandro, who's going to go through some of the things happening here locally in the UAE. So Alejandro, please.
Thank you, Steve. Let me share my screen here. Make sure that, sorry here, I don't know if, can you see the, oh, there it is. So I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. What I'm going to talk about is one of the topics that Robert has already alluded to. It's about these initiatives that are happening around the world and that need to continue happening in order for us to be able to promote the uptake and the production of sustainable aviation fuels around the world. Specifically for the UAE, it is a very important topic because the UAE is one of the biggest players in world aviation. It is only behind the USA and Canada in terms of both RPKs and RTKs. And so this places the UAE at a very particular juncture. It's a huge aviation market, and we need to recognize that as such. Aviation is also a sector that is of a very strategic importance for the UAE. The investments that have been made in both airport and aircraft infrastructure are well exceeding $270 billion or 1 trillion dirhams. And it is a significant chunk of the country's gross domestic product. And so aviation is without a question a sector of strategic importance for the UAE. One other thing that is very interesting and important is that the UAE has very recently become a live, I would say, nuclear power. This past Friday, the first nuclear reactor in the UAE has become critical, as they say in the industry, which means that it is essentially already online. And so that, together with significant investments that have been made in the largest solar parks around the world, and not only the largest, but the lowest cost solar parks. About a month ago, it was announced that this Al Dhafra solar PV project in Abu Dhabi achieved a price of 1.35 cents US cents per kilowatt hour, which is a world record. And what that essentially says is that the UAE has access to a lot and low cost and low carbon, which is the key here, low carbon energy. And I'm not going to talk about this because my two co-panelists have already addressed this at length. But the only thing that needs to be said is that the UAE needs a holistic strategy to address its carbon emissions from the aviation sector. And so if we take all of these factors into account and we look at what can be done here in the UAE to produce sustainable aviation fuels, we find that in the examples that Jim was talking about in the US that take corn or that take some other form of, for example, the greases, the vegetable oils, those feedstocks are essentially not available here in the UAE. The UAE is a water-constrained region. We have essentially no fresh water. We have no arable land. And so all of the category, or that entire category of potential feedstocks that come from biomass are going to be very difficult to develop here, if not impossible. One category is these halophytes that we have been working on here in the UAE through the Sustainable Bioenergy Research Consortium. And we have, and we are continuing to work on them. But even if we are very successful, and let's say that we're able to plant 100,000 hectares of halophytes in the next 10 years, it will only be able to comply with a tiny part of the demand for these types of fuels. And so we need to look at any and all of the other feedstocks that are available. And so we have some of the examples that have already been alluded to, for example, through municipal solid waste or some agricultural waste and used cooking oil that are available in this country. And then we need to look into these carbon-rich gases or into the potential for producing synthetic gas from which we can produce these power-to-liquids or e-fuels that are gaining a lot of steam through the use of low-carbon hydrogen. When we're talking about hydrogen, there's a gamut of colors that many people have heard about. But the key to all of these is that you can have access to low-carbon hydrogen. And the UAE has a lot of potential to be able to do that. And so there are other sources that could potentially be available. However, in the case, for example, of microalgae, there has not been a lot of work done here in the UAE, and therefore we need to take that into consideration. So the way we propose that we continue our work down the path of establishing a sustainable aviation fuel industry in the UAE is by establishing a coalition or a large working group that looks into this problem from several perspectives and that tries to address the need of establishing this vibrant and solid industry to produce sustainable aviation fuels in the UAE. And this is an example that takes a page from many of the other efforts that have been done around the world. Jim mentioned one, CAFI, the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative in the US. There are many others around the world. And SAFI, or the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Initiative for the UAE, is one potential path forward. The idea is to bring together all of the different aircraft operators, the airlines that operate in the UAE, the airports that are a part of the infrastructure, all of the OEMs that build aircraft and build engines, the oil and gas sector that has to have a significant participation in this, of course, the academic sector or the research sector, as well as all of the international organizations, the financial sector, and the governmental bodies that participate or have a stake in producing these types of fuels. There are other industries like the power sector and industries that support that sector that are also very important. And so again, the idea or the aim of SAFI UAE is to guarantee the aviation industry license to grow sustainably by enabling, promoting, and developing a vibrant sustainable aviation fuel industry here in the UAE. And the idea is to explore all of these feedstocks and come to answers as to how we can use them in the best way possible. We would look at specifically 5 pillars. We would look at the technology pillar, as has been mentioned. There are technologies out there that have already been approved, that are already being used at commercial levels. However, and there are other technologies that are coming along. And so we need to look at what technologies are there. We need to do R&D on technologies that could be developed or help in developing. We have to look at the policy aspect of this. We have to look at the sustainability aspect of this, because this is key for the aviation industry. And we also need to look at this from a business development perspective so that we are able to bring these projects to fruition. And so the only thing to say here is that really, because of COVID-19, it's we have in a sense, many people look at this, and Robert alluded to this a little bit. This is a tragedy for the industry. The industry is decimated, as has been mentioned. However, out of these ashes, there needs to be a beam of light. And I think that for example, in Europe, there has been a very clear mandate that environmental projects associated with aviation need to move forward. The IATA Declaration recognizes this. So there's no time to waste to address the emissions from the aviation sector. The UAE is in a prime position to be a world leader in the abatement of aviation emissions if it moves in this direction. And to be quite honest, the UAE's core industries are perfectly aligned to take on this challenge. And so for this reason, what we have done is that we have created what we are calling the SAFI UAE webinar series. And this is our first session today. We will be addressing many of the important topics that have to do with sustainable aviation fuels over the next 8 weeks. We will have a weekly session, and so I invite you to log into this website here that will explain to you all of the different sessions and all of the different speakers that have already agreed to help us in this effort. And again, the idea is to, at the end of this webinar series, to be able to arrive at a place where we're able to launch this effort, where we bring all of the different stakeholders together so that we can work together to address this enormous challenge. And with that, Steve, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Alejandro. I appreciate that. So now we're going to go into a discussion around the presentations. As I said previously, anyone that's attending that would like to ask questions, please drop your question in the chat and I'll get to your question in the order that it's submitted. Let me first, though, come back to some of my own questions, and I'd like to start with the big picture here. We talked about carbon neutral growth, which is very, very important as a policy for the industry going forward. Carbon neutral growth was to happen from 2020 onward. Now, if I understand it correctly, the marking of emissions in aviation is not happening from 2020, given the pandemic. It's going to be from 2019 levels, if I'm correct. So I'd like a perspective from maybe Robert, Jim, and Alejandro, if you'd like to contribute. What does that actually do to the industry? Are we really moving towards sustainability because now we've gone into a situation where emissions are quite low this year, and we've reset our emission target to a level that was much higher prior to our baseline years? So give me a perspective on what that's done to the impetus to really move us ahead quickly with the need for sustainable aviation fuels. Maybe we'll start with Robert, if you have a thought.
Sure, Steve. Yeah, I'm happy to give a view on that. It's a good question. I know there may be different views. I'll happily share the IATA perspective. We did actively lobby for the baseline calculation to be changed. So as you say, it should have been an average of 2019 and 2020. Now, I think just to explain exactly what you meant, if we did include 2020 in the calculation, you saw my chart at the very start, you're clearly going to get a different average to what you would have got if you averaged, let's say, 2018 and 2019, and what we expected 2020 to be. In fact, we would have gone towards carbon neutral growth 2011 or 2012, so now from the environmental side, I perfectly understand the logic here, and yes, you could say it would accelerate ambition, etc. However, the CORSIA agreement was tricky, and Jim might talk to it more. It's politically tricky. It still is, and it would have actually changed probably the intent, for what many countries agreed to when CORSIA was agreed in 2013 and then sort of reaffirmed in 2016. In my view, the political risk of that wasn't worth not changing that. In that, if you on the one hand could have the CORSIA agreement breaking down versus an adjustment to it, I'd take the adjustment from my perspective.
Yeah, so I think Robert covered that well. I would note that CORSIA is an interesting agreement because the international community came together and it's brought together the entire world. It's brought together the UAE, the US, Canada, Russia, China, you name it. A lot of countries came together around CORSIA as a path forward. And when it was developed, there was an accepted level of ambition, which was basically the average of 2019, 2020, with an expectation that there would be growth in 2020 relative to 2019. Not that there was an expectation that there would then be half the emissions, gone at 2020, which would dramatically change the situation. So this is a situation where the community basically reaffirmed their level of commitment.
And so just to follow on, unless Alejandro would like to contribute to that particular question, the follow-on I have is, and it relates to one of the questions I saw coming through. The question was with regard to what the split is between business travel and domestic travel, primarily for vacationing, these types of things. What if the industry doesn't see a return to significant business travel, international business travel? What if a year, 2 year passes and all these discussions about, well, the web meetings are good enough, we're pretty efficient, it's actually sustainable to be doing this rather than flying to see each other for the meeting. If that were to happen in the coming years, would there be a rethink or be a necessary rethink on the paradigm for how aviation sustainability is going to progress in the future? Because now we're looking, as I said in the beginning, it's basically a new set of rules we're playing by. So has there been discussion in the industry about this? What if all this talk about a permanent means of doing business changes and everything becomes maybe domestic? We're not flying international all the time, and there's more short haul flights going around for small vacations within countries. Any thoughts on this?
I'll happily share a quick view. Look, the sector as it may look slightly different when it does recover from this. I don't personally see the shape you described exactly, although I do acknowledge, I think we are learning, as we're doing today, to be quite effective on, in a virtual setting when we have to be. Will it change the ambition? I think one key thing I would say is that CORSIA hasn't really been the prime focus for the industry in the past 2, 3, 4 years from a strategic sense. It's definitely from a compliance sense and understanding what we need to do to be, in line with the regulations that have been established at ICAO. But to be honest, the biggest thing that is on our minds and keeps us awake is the achievement of the long-term goal. And Jim alluded to in his presentation as well with the ICAO. So when I talk about a long-term goal, I'm talking about the industry, the airline industry. But ICAO then is looking at establishing a long-term aspirational goal as well. That's going to be a second impetus there. So I think it'll be a very interesting topic in the next assembly in 2022. Jim might have thoughts, but to me, our vision is on these interim targets towards the long-term goal. There needs to be substantial, way beyond what CORSIA is. CORSIA is just a blip in terms of the achievement of our long-term objectives, and more the focus is on that. And I don't see any part of society changing their sort of view that we need to be ambitious and achieve that.
And I wanted just to chime in here. This is exactly why we are proposing that we have these initiatives. We need to really push the industry to develop these fuels and to invest in the development of these fuels. And there's a debate, as Jim alluded to. There's a debate within the FTG related to LCAF, and LCAF, lower carbon aviation fuels, are seen as a potential contributor in this region of the world. But lower carbon aviation fuels are not for free. There needs to be investment made so that you are able to reach the carbon intensity and qualify for a lower carbon aviation fuel. And so it's not as if it's the solution for this region. It may be part of a portfolio of solutions, and this is exactly why we need to work very diligently to promote these fuels, and to promote the research, and to promote the technologies that are going to be bringing these fuels to fruition, and especially at the scale that is needed. In 2019, the UAE uplifted approximately 14 billion liters of fuel. So this is a huge amount of fuel that, if you compare it to the fuel that is being produced, the SAF that is being produced worldwide is extremely low. And so we need to push this forward, and we need to push hard to reach that long-term goal that Robert was mentioning.
Jim, would you like to say anything? I have one more.
I'll add something very touch a slightly different tone than my co-panelist. And I would note that international travel is an interesting creature. So within the U.S., there's a certain view on climate and the importance of it. Within the UAE, there's a certain view. Within, I'll pick a country, France, there's a certain view. And those views vary based on our local circumstances, and a lot of other things. However, with international travel, the view of the UAE on climate is not all important. It's the view of the origin and the destination, because there has to be a flight to come back, and there has to be people willing to get onto that flight. So the pressure that the international community puts forward on climate for aviation is different than what any individual country sees within its domestic sector. There's a very different perspective in the U.S. for international aviation and aviation in general when it comes to climate than, let's say, automotive, and that shows in some of our domestic policy making. So it's important to remember that whenever we're thinking international aviation, it's not just the domestic views that matter and where the pressures are coming, and I see the pressures increasing with time on climate.
That's a good point. I think that helped me go to Alejandro.
Can I just make a comment here? You're absolutely right, and this is the issue with the UAE, that the UAE has no domestic aviation to speak of, and so we really need to make sure that we take that into account.
And so this is a point I wanted to raise, and it looks at the governments and their roles. And many of these questions were coming up now about how we can stimulate these initiatives. I'm gonna ask a question, and I didn't see this pop up in what Alejandro is presenting around technology, although it's been on my mind, and it relates to my prior question about, will business travel, international travel come back in a big way? We're thinking now about how COVID-19 is prompting governments to bring money to the airlines and to the aviation sector in general to help rescue them, so to speak. Now, I've seen in France, for instance, the package that's been put together is really is kind of interesting in the sense that, if I recall correctly, there is money going to Airbus to develop a short-haul electric-powered aviation, which is perfectly viable for the future with battery densities getting much higher. It could be that if we don't see that return to demand for long-haul transport and the need for very energy-dense aviation fuels, maybe something like what France is doing, and there's most likely others that are thinking regionally, they're going to start moving toward electrification in aviation. And so is that a technology paradigm that we need to be thinking about in the broader sustainability realm of aviation? It's always been taboo to say this, that you're going to fly planes on batteries. But now it's, it's seeming like it's something, at least in short haul transport, could happen. And it could, again, change the way we're thinking about these initiatives. So maybe Alejandro, you might want to start, and then we come back to the others on this topic.
I mean, for sure, the major OEMs are all looking into, building, especially in the medium term, short haul flights that are fully powered with electric energy. And so the question is, what are we going to do when we fly these long distances, these long haul international flights? The Abu Dhabi to New York, the Dubai to Los Angeles. The technology, or at least the forecast, isn't going to change in the next 30 to 50 years as to how we fly currently. And so this is why there's a need for these fuels, for these sustainable aviation fuels. But I'll let Robert and Jim chime in on this.
Yeah, I'll chime in first, let you finish it off, Robert. So I've seen some of the discussion on electric aircraft, and for a great case in point would be Norway. Alaska could be a similar case in point, where there's not a lot of road structure. There's water or other barriers separating point A from point B. You have very slim demand, i.e. there's demand there, but it's not a lot of people, but they're critical. That's the only way they're going to get from point A to point B. So in as much as we are using batteries to replace leaded avgas in these single prop aircraft, that's awesome. That's great. I do not see us using batteries because of physics to go with any number of people that matters for any length at all. So you might be able to get from Dubai to, maybe nearby airports within, a couple hundred kilometers maybe, and then I mean like 200 kilometers for 2 dozen people maybe. But if you actually want to travel with 50 to 100 people for any sort of distance, it's not happening. So this is why we have to have these drop-in sustainably produced fuels, because that's the only way we're going to be able to do the key function of aviation sustainably.
I think that's well said from both my co-panelists. But one other point, Steve, you sort of said it's a taboo topic. It really isn't from the industry's point of view. We've got a technology sort of area here that, if it was here today and you could fly a 380 and a 747 on electric, we would love it. That's brilliant. But unfortunately, the physics just doesn't support it. And I'll give you one other interesting statistic. We've looked at what impact could electric have. Basically, could you just say, let's just sit on our hands and hope for the best with electric? If we could replace every single aircraft in the world up to 100 seats for every flight up to 1,000 kilometers, it reduces our global net CO2 footprint by around about 20%. It's just, these wide body long haul aircraft are the aircraft that produce the most emissions because they're using the most, magnitudes more fuel. And that's the reality. So yeah, it'll develop and we welcome it, but it does not change the necessity to develop SAF fast.
That makes sense. Alejandro, his idea for the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Initiative and the location in the UAE, here, international travel is what you do. There is no domestic flying so much in this country the size of the UAE. And so I think as long as we're pursuing this initiative, there may be regional initiatives around electrification of aircraft and more short haul flights, but certainly let's hope that long haul flights do stay relevant, at least for our part of the world. I want to turn now to the technology. We're moving in that direction anyway, and there's a few questions that came in, and I think they are kind of interesting, especially since both Jim and Alejandro talked specifically about different technology sets for sustainable aviation fuel. One of the questions that came up was the area of electrofuels. Alejandro talked about hydrogen, and that's a big hot topic in energy these days. It's probably the topic of the year in the overall energy sector. When you take hydrogen and then you combine that with carbon dioxide, you start to have some interesting set of fuels which are compatible with current technologies. So in this overall set of technologies that we're talking about, the fuels we're talking about, maybe Jim and Alejandro would talk a little bit about it, and specifically the question came to Jim. In those different organizations, companies, technology we're talking about, were there any doing electrofuels? And then what level of support, what kind of support is needed to bring those fuels to the market? Is it going to be government support? Is it going to be regulation? How do you get those kind of fuels further progressed? Then we'll come back to Alejandro on this topic. Please, Jim.
Yeah. So electrofuels, or power to liquids, as they're sometimes called, is a very interesting subject area. It's because you're able, to take, you could take some of that very, very, very inexpensive solar electricity that Alejandro pointed out, along with some form of hydrogen, whether it's electrolysis of salt water, or, you could go blue hydrogen, where you strip the carbon off of your methane and get your hydrogen that way. And then you can create a fuel. That is, for some place like the UAE, I find that to be a fascinating prospect, because you have the resources, you have the natural resources there to do such a thing. Within the United States, we have no shortage of fresh water. We have no shortage of agricultural products. Unfortunately, we have no shortage of waste. So because of that, we in the United States are leveraging our lowest cost feedstocks. And, that's the economically reasonable thing for us to do. And so whenever I go and talk to folks, I talk about, how we need to leverage the use of our waste products more, because we in the U.S. have a lot of agricultural, forest, and municipal waste. So that's, the U.S. perspective, and that's what you're seeing us doing in our production right now, because it's the economically rational thing to do. But power to liquids are interesting from my perspective. I'd hand it over to Alejandro.
No, and again, this is exactly the thesis that we're putting forward, is exactly that, right? We can't use what we don't have, and we have to concentrate and focus on what is available here. And at the end of the day, this is all going to be a function of the life cycle emissions of that particular fuel that you produce. And so if you have a way of getting access to low carbon hydrogen, be that because you're doing electrolysis of water, that in this region clearly may be an issue unless it's salt water, but then you have some barriers there. But again, you have to look at the entire life cycle emissions of the fuel that you're producing. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is reduce the carbon intensity of that fuel, so that you're able to either classify that fuel as a lower carbon aviation fuel or as a sustainable aviation fuel. And so this is why there's an R&D aspect of this that is very important, but there's also a very important aspect of business development that I think that we need to look into this. And I think that Robert has also, maybe you want to comment on this as well.
Robert, would you like to add anything to that?
I mean, not substantially, Steve, but I'd just say from the airline's point of view very quickly, we don't have a favourite when it comes to any form of technology, just that it must be safe. And there's already a test to determine that, fit for purpose test under ASTM D7566. Safe and sustainable. And then I think as Jim, there's ways to measure sustainability on a life cycle basis. Then as Jim says, economics, depending on where you are in the world, should dictate which fuels rise to the top first. I think ultimately we're going to need all of them. But economics, I think, is important in the early stages.
Okay.
Yeah. This isn't an either or. This is all of the above. Thank you.
Well, we have about 3 minutes left. And so far you've convinced me that long-haul aviation is not dead, and not everything is going to be about batteries. And we still have to worry about sustainable aviation fuels that are going to be energy dense, which is good. So we can at least make people not worry so much about that. And the final comment from each panelist, my question to you is, if you were going to put together the roadmap for sustainable aviation fuels, and you were going to start with a fuel that we could get going with quickly, let's say 2020, 2021, get the sector moving in an economically viable way toward adopting the fuels, and then moving towards, say, 2050, where there's a very potentially revolutionary fuel that would maybe be a little bit difficult to adopt in the near term, but requires R&D and requires government support to push toward it. What would those two fuels be, near term, long term, assuming that we can line up, of course, all the policy measures and support to make that long-term vision happen? So we'll start with, let's say, Alejandro, and then we'll go to Jim, and then finish off with Robert. And a very short answer, please.
Yeah, in my mind, it's very clear. The short term or the quick available feedstock that we have here is municipal solid waste. However, there are policies in place that are moving towards incinerating the municipal solid waste and not gasifying it, so that we take advantage of the carbon in that waste stream. And so there may be policy issues that we need to take into consideration there. And then I'm sorry, in the long term, for sure, these electrofuels are the answer for the UAE. And there remains to be seen how we produce those electrofuels, for sure.
Okay. Jim?
Yeah, my answer is not dramatically different. We need to, leverage the existing waste resources we have, and we need any sort of vegetable oil, fats, oils, greases, that sort of thing. Those are relatively easily upgraded to jet fuel. That's an obvious target. In the U.S., that could be purpose-grown rotation crops, as well as utilizing all of our waste streams. Those are various, very obvious targets of opportunity that we're doing our best to exploit now. You get into the longer term, you'd want to expand out to also get into the energy grasses, figure out how to use all your lignocellulosic resources. Algae would be a wonderful thing to figure out. I'm sure we will at some point well before 2050 to unlock the oils out of algae, or to go straight to hydrocarbons, as they're thinking about doing with the BB oil technique from Iwo Jima Heavy Industries. And then longer term, in as much as we need additional fuel, and I'm very confident we will, then we would go to electrofuels to fill in that gap. And places like the UAE that have dirt cheap solar are very obvious targets of opportunity there. But in the short term, medium term, long term, I see drop in fuels because of the fact we need to leverage our existing fleet of aircraft, and jet fuel is some amazing stuff in terms of safety and energy density.
Thanks. Anything to add, Robert?
I just said, I guess before, that I wouldn't pick a winner, so I'm not going to do that. That said, I don't disagree with anything that Alejandro or Jim just said, especially Jim. They had quite a nice spectrum of possibility there. One thing I would just leave you with is global policy must direct feedstock to the hard to decarbonise sectors. It does not make sense to be sending feedstock that, for things like burning rubbish for electricity when we have other options to do it, when we have sectors such as aviation and shipping that don't have those alternatives and really do need the feedstock. So that's what I would say at a macro sense, and that's probably one of the biggest sort of advocacy initiatives that we are pushing, is to make sure feedstock goes to the right sector.
Thanks, Robert. Well, I appreciate that. And so now we've come to the end. We have a very interesting discussion, and what was clear to me in this entire course of discussion is that there is a wide range of fuels that we have at our potential disposal, near-term, long-term. R&D, policy, government support's required. What Alejandro mentioned about the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Initiative, I think is very important. I hope it takes off. For those of you watching, more to come. There'll be more webinars. Alejandro mentioned about that. And so I'm very optimistic that the initiative will take off, and then we'll see aviation continue and also be more sustainable in the future. With that said, we do need to close. And so I thank Robert, I thank James, I thank Alejandro. I'll turn it back over to Rebecca at IAEE for the final word before we finish off. Rebecca?
IAEE wishes to thank Steve Griffiths and our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar. This webinar will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you are not already a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I now officially close this webinar.
Thank you.